Thank you very much for having me here. My apologies and condolences to those of you who thought we were going to have another speaker. I'll try not to disappoint. I was not aware that this group existed. As much as I'm a bona fide oil man, which we'll find out later if we believe that I'm a bona fide oil man, but I was an international relations major in college at Colorado College. I studied international law at NYU Law School and have spent much of my life thinking about and studying international affairs. So I definitely consider you my people, and I'm very honored to be here. I've certainly looked through your website and seen the people that you've had here in the past speaking to you, and it's a daunting task here. Task made more daunting by the fact that your audience is full of legitimate oil people. That's a little bit nervous-making for me as well. As Bruce said in the introduction, and the cover slide of my presentation says, I am a mere lawyer. I'm not, in fact, a geoscientist or an engineer. I merely impersonate one during these lectures. So feel free to take everything that I say tonight with a grain of salt, and don't be shy about asking questions at the end. I am not only a lawyer, but I'm a lawyer for an oil company, Forest Oil Corporation to be exact, headquartered here in Denver. I do also always have to give the caveat that everything I say up here is purely my opinion and does not necessarily reflect any views of Forest Oil or any of their management or directors. I got interested in the idea of peak oil a couple years ago. While I am, like I said, not a geoscientist myself, I am the son of a geologist. In the oil industry, that's actually an epithet, but I use it to establish credibility at talks like this. My father worked for Gulf Oil and is now a consultant, has his own firm, and so I spent my youth following him around in the oil fields and picking up little bits and pieces here and there, and eventually followed him into the business. And so that's the background that I bring to this issue. But as I was saying at dinner, energy is one of those issues that is fundamental to everything about our life. It's impossible to think about anything really about modern life that doesn't implicate energy, and specifically access to cheap energy. I'm going to get into my slides here, so I'm going to stick a little closer to the podium. The idea that is basically the premise of the talk is this graph shows the growth in oil production basically since the beginning of the oil age. And I apologize, the numbers on the side don't really come through, but the shape of the graph is really all you need to know. And the basic fact that oil is a finite commodity, we're not killing any dinosaurs anymore, tells us that that sort of rate of increase is problematic at best. But while energy is certainly one of the most important things that defines modern life, I think it's also one of the most poorly understood aspects of modern life. So before I get into the talk in too much detail, I am going to spend a little bit, just a very short background as to some fundamentals about the oil business. But at the very beginning, I want to set aside maybe a couple preconceptions that you might be coming into the talk with. Number one, the idea of peak oil itself. Peak oil is a theory that has to do with the rate of oil production. Peak oil theory does not suggest that we are out of oil, that we are nearly out of oil, or, quite frankly, that we will ever be out of oil. A very famous Saudi geologist once said, "The Stone Age did not end for lack of stone. The oil age will not end for lack of oil." I think that's a very prescient statement. So peak oil, at its essence, is the idea that sometime, maybe in the near future, maybe in the medium-term future, maybe according to the most optimistic people in the somewhat more distant future, there will come a day that the average daily production of crude oil in the world will reach its maximum rate. Currently, we produce about 85 million barrels of liquid fuels, really, but for most of us, we think of that as the oil number. We produce about 85 million barrels a day, and at some point, that number is not going to get any bigger. Part of this talk will talk about whether that number is 85 million or whether that number is going to be bigger than that. But the basic idea is that that number will stop growing one day. And that everything that we think about, again, as being modern humans, really fundamentally rests on the idea that that number will continue to grow. And that's the real idea that's most important for me to put out there this evening, is for you to begin to consider what that means, the various implications that that idea has, that the cheap access to ever-increasing amounts of petroleum will someday stop being true. So, let's go into our agenda and Petroleum Geology 101. This is, again, taught by a lawyer, so this is going to be very high level. But I think one of the things that I think people come away from most often from my talk is this slide. I think most of us, when we think about the oil business and the production of oil, we think of giant swimming pools of oil sitting under the ground. And smart guys like Peter Link and Bob Mead, geologists, go out and they look for funny wrinkles in the land. Back when Peter started doing this, now we do it with computers and things like that. But they look at surface formations that suggest what might be happening underground, and they think that they might have found one of these giant swimming pools. And so then the drillers come in and they poke a hole in the ground and they stick a giant metal straw in the ground. And if Peter's right, they suck out this huge amount of oil from the swimming pool until the swimming pool runs dry. Then they put a top on it and they go on and they look for another swimming pool. Sadly, that is not the case. It's somewhat harder than that. And to produce economic quantities of oil, you basically need to find 5 things in the same place. You need a good source rock, meaning you got to have the right conglomeration of dead dinosaurs. Really, it's mostly plants, little tiny bits of plankton and things like that. But it's more colorful to think of them as dead dinosaurs. And that source rock has to have been buried at a certain depth, under a certain pressure, at a certain heat, for a long period of time. And that's sort of a rough approximation of the zone that will give you oil if you've got the right rock, if you've got it there long enough. If it's too shallow, you're going to get gooey sort of stuff like the Alberta tar sands that you've probably read some about in the newspaper, which is basically oil that isn't done yet. Or maybe the shale out in western Colorado that everyone thinks if we get a $10 increase in the price of oil will finally become economic, but in my view never will. If it goes too deep, then it gets too hot. It gets too much pressure and you'll overcook the oil. And then you'll get natural gas, typically. Or it gets really hot and it just cooks away and you have an empty hole. But the other thing is the swimming pool. They're not actually swimming pools. The oil exists in tiny little pores in these certain specific types of rock. So, for the right rock to be there, it has to be sufficiently porous, it has to have porosity, and it has to be sufficiently permeable. Porosity talks about the size of those little holes in the rock where the oil exists. And you got to have a good enough ratio of holes to rock to make the accumulation of oil big enough. And that rock has to be sufficiently permeable. And what that means is that the oil can move between these different pores in the rock at sufficient quantity to get to your big metal straw that you've poked down into the ground. So you need those things. You also need a cap rock. You need some sort of rock on top of your formation of source rock that's much thicker, that's not permeable. And so that holds the oil in place from the top because it's under immense pressure. It wants to seep up And we have huge quantities of oil that are seeping out of the ground all over the world, especially into the oceans every day, where they don't have cap rock. So then you also need a trap. You need some sort of trap on the two sides of the reservoir. Those can be either stratigraphic traps or structural traps typically, but you need walls. You need walls on your reservoir. And finally, that can't leak. If it leaks at all over the hundreds of millions of years that it's working, you will lose all your oil. So, if you talk to geologists, you'll typically find that they're outdoorsmen who like to camp. The reason that is that 9 times out of 10, when they go looking for oil, they don't find any oil. But at least they've had a good camping trip. So, let's get into the meat of it. Those 5 things don't happen very often. And when they do happen, they tend to happen in small reservoirs. So what this is just a graph showing in the world how often you get big oil fields. So these are oil fields that are 1 billion barrels or more of oil in place, and you get almost none of those. And on the other end of the graph are anytime you see some oily rock when you drill a hole. And there's a ton of those, but most of the time we don't care about them. Another way to show that is this is a little bit dated graph, but it's not for our purposes. It's essentially still true. This shows how those big fields are distributed around the world. So one of the sort of confusing things is I told you at the beginning we do about 85 million barrels of liquid fuel. Not all of that is oil, and this is a graph of real crude oil and condensate, which is a smaller chunk of that number. So that's why it doesn't add to 85. But don't get wrapped up in that. So your top line, these are fields, and these aren't by reservoir size. These are by production, daily production rates. That's what we really care about. That's what you care about for your car, for turning on your light switches. That's what we care about peak oil. It doesn't really matter how much is in the tank. What matters is how big is the tap. Think of it that way. So in the entire world, there are four fields in the entire world that currently produce over 1 million barrels a day. There's the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia. That field produces about the same amount of oil every single day as the entire lower 48. About 5.5 million barrels a day. Second is the Bergen field in Kuwait. Produces around 2 million a day. Cantarell in Mexico, which used to produce around 2 million barrels a day. It peaked a few years ago and is crashing at a rate of losing about 15% of its production rate every year. And then fourth is the Daqing field in China. 4 fields in the entire world produce more than 1 million barrels a day. In 2000, they aggregated about 8 million barrels a day. So about 1/8 of all the crude oil and condensate came from 4 fields in the world. The next size, you've got 10 fields producing another 5.9 million. The next size, 12 fields at 4.1 million. You can see down there, but fields that produce over 100,000 barrels a day, you add those all up, you get 116 fields all around the world. They produce about 32 million barrels a day. That's just under half of all the oil produced in the world. The rest comes from about 4,000 other fields. Right? You don't have to be an oil man, you don't have to be a statistician or a mathematician to know that those 116 fields are disproportionately important to the picture relative to the other 4,000. Those are our important fields. Okay, we're going to switch gears for a second. As we said before, peak oil is about rate. It's about flow rate. It's about how much we can produce in a given day all around the world. The basic theory of peak oil was first vocalized by a scientist from Shell Oil, Hubbert, who's a geoscientist, their head geoscientist for Shell Oil. And he did an incredible amount of very detailed math, looking at all these fields all around North America that he knew about, because we have very detailed reporting requirements, frankly, in America. We have very good detail information on field-by-field data. So he did a lot of very hard math in 1956. He did a speech to the United States Geological Survey where he predicted that the United States would reach its peak rate of oil production in about 1970. Before he went onto the stage, he was on the phone with The Hague in the Netherlands, the headquarters of Shell Oil, where they were talking to him, asking him, please don't do this speech. This is gonna subject you to ridicule, us, the company, to ridicule. This is you really need to do more research into this. This is just crazy. He went ahead and gave the speech. He talked about it much after that speech, and the rate of oil production in the United States peaked in late 1970. The idea that Hubbert basically had was that you have, in any given field, you have various wells. Some of them produce better than others, higher rates than others. Some of them produce longer than others, but they all eventually peak and they go down. So you add all the wells together in a given field, and you're going to get a curve for that whole field. And that what was important about what he found was that the peak tended to happen for a given field at about half. When about half of the oil that was ultimately going to be produced was gone, the field would peak. Now that varies somewhat. It can vary anywhere from like 45 to 65, but it's a good rule of thumb to use, and certainly it was a good thumb to use back in his day, before we were nearly as sophisticated about our reservoir management. So a little sidebar here. You may have remembered the president told us a couple years ago in his State of the Union that we're all addicted to oil. You may be familiar with the various 12-step programs that people have to deal with that. Apparently he's just working on, he's got the first one down. So we'll check in with him later and see if he's come up with the other 11 steps. So, a couple ground rules here. Oil is finite. There are some people that argue that it's not, that there's still oil being produced. I do not share that view. I don't think that's a mainstream view. It's certainly a topic that people are welcome to debate, but I'm not one of them who debates it. If you agree with the first point, the second point necessarily follows. If we are not making more oil, then necessarily the production rate will at some time peak. The third point is equally important. As much discussion as there is about when this will happen, some of it's an interesting academic geological debate. It certainly has very wide-ranging implications. Unfortunately, it can't be answered definitively until after the fact. It was true in the United States. It wasn't until 1971 or so that people started really thinking that the United States may have peaked. That was before we started producing the Prudhoe Bay field in Alaska. So there was a long time still where people thought we'd go back up over that peak once Prudhoe came online. We didn't. So it won't be until it's in the rearview mirror for a while that we will know that for sure. That does not lessen the importance of the date, however. Another fundamental part of Hubbert's analysis is the relationship between oil discovery and oil production. Right? For those of us who aren't technicians in the oil industry, this is fairly intuitive, right? You can't produce oil that you haven't discovered. The discovery peak in the United States was in the 1930s. Those were the years that we discovered most of our oil. As I said, we peaked in our production around 1970. What this graph shows is global discoveries and production rates. And the graph is backloaded so that What happens is over time, typically, you will increase the number of reserves you attribute to a field because you start to learn more about them. You're going to be more conservative about what you claim as proved reserves when you first discover a field. But so what this graph says is, you know, we're still going to give you credit for them in 1960 if that's when you discovered the field. Even though you weren't sure that you had that oil until 1973, we're going to give you credit in that initial year that you discovered the field. So you need to know that about that graph. But once you know that, this is the last year that discovery equaled or exceeded production. That is about 1990, and that year, as you can see, also is an aberration. If you take that out, it was about 6 years earlier. So it's been roughly a generation since we've had a year that we've found more oil than we've produced in the world. Again, you don't have to be a Nobel Prize winner to deduce from that a problem. When we're thinking about the gas price, we all get angry when we're filling up our tanks. But I think it's also important to think about, really, at $112 a barrel, $114 today, really how cheap oil is. If you take a grande latte at Starbucks, anyone guess how much that is a barrel?
$1,000?
$1,008. $1,008 a barrel for your Starbucks lattes. But you don't have people throwing garbage cans through Starbucks windows demanding that they lower their price, or sending emails saying, don't buy lattes on Tuesday from Starbucks and that'll get them to bring the price down to 13 cents a latte.
John, understand that 7 milliliters of Chanel No. 5 costs the same as a barrel of oil.
Interesting. Well, see, that makes Chanel seem cheap to me, but maybe I'm thinking about that wrong. This is a very pretty graph that shows one possible scenario of how this will all then play out. The red again is the discoveries per year. The multi-bar graph is the production rate. This is a couple. Actually, it's more or less up to date. It's maybe a year out of date, but this is one of several predictions that are out there for when that discovery curve is going to come home to roost. This is a picture of where we ended up last year. This is global production changes in the major producers. It makes this very nice symmetrical graph, but unfortunately that's kind of bad news. The net change in 2007 was an actual reduction. As an average over 2006, we produced almost 300,000 barrels of oil per day less than we produced in 2006. 2007, you may recall, was like the few years before it, marked by significant increases in the price of oil. Again, I think here the amateurs in each of us can deduce pretty easily that economics should be playing a role here. And that's one of the infuriating things when you talk to economists about this problem, is they say, well, you just need a sufficiently strong price signal. If you get the price signal strong enough, then you'll eliminate demand on the bottom line, and you'll stimulate production on the other side. True enough, but we had a pretty strong price signal last year. We've had a pretty strong price signal for a few years now. But it's not quite doing exactly what we think it should. This is another
Question on that last graph.
Sure.
Is any of the decrease in production, I noticed Saudi Arabia is way over to the right with the decreased production, is that artificial by any chance, that they're reducing it for a reason?
Excellent question.
Are they doing the best they can?
If you ask the Saudi Arabians, they will say, "Oh, well, of course.
Would you repeat the question,
about
John?
1.5 million. We have about 1.5 million barrels per day of spare production capacity. Of course, we could produce more if we wanted, but we don't really have buyers for that crude."
What's the question?
That's kind of true. Oh, sorry. The question was, on the graph here, is it possible that any of the reductions year on year were voluntary? Right? We do have a production cartel in the world. It's called OPEC. Their stated mission is to actively manage production among those biggest producers for the specific purpose of manipulating price. Right? Of course, the problem is that they've never really done that before. They've never successfully done that for any period of time that's meaningful. But if you ask other people, they're more skeptical. But that's another takeaway point from tonight. In the United States, we have excellent publicly available data on a field-by-field, reservoir-by-reservoir basis that will tell you about everything you need to know about our existing oil production capacity. Europeans are the same. The North Sea, excellent data quality. The national oil companies, the OPECs, Russia, countries like that, produce no publicly available data. The whole geological debate about peak oil and predicting peak flows could probably be resolved in about a week with a room full of petroleum geologists and engineers poring over field-by-field production data from the biggest producers. But they don't make that available. It's hard to predict whether our government could make that information available with sufficient pressure, but it's easy to say that they're not trying to do so. And it's easy to show that that information is critical to each of us, and that having that data would make a world of difference and might eliminate some interesting debates that we have on nights like this, but I, for one, would be happy to end the debates and know the answer. So it's a good question. Thank you for asking it. This is sort of the same. Oh, right. The purpose of this graph is to show that we actually beat the previous record. The previous record, some people had been thinking that we had already peaked in late 2005. I'd be happy to know that in January we beat that record by about $100,000 a barrel, 100,000 barrels a day. That is essentially meaningless to you and me, but it is a signal that the debate's still going on, but it's at sort of margins of error sort of levels. The EIA is the Energy Information Agency. It's our governmental agency that's charged with the task of finding all this information out and telling us about it so that we can make good decisions. They're historically awful at predicting things, and so this is a depiction of their approach to the peak oil problem. I don't know if you can read the caption. It says, "I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. So I wouldn't be fair if I didn't give a mention to the other side of this debate. Probably the most prominent party on the other side of the peak oil debate is an outfit called CIRA. They're a consultancy that advises countries like Saudi Arabia, giant oil companies, the U.S. government, things like that. It's headed by a guy named Daniel Yergin, who won the Pulitzer Prize for an excellent book on the history of the oil industry, The Prize. I encourage everybody to read that, but I won't tell you much about peak oil, but it's an interesting read. CIRA's prediction is that there won't be a peak so much as a plateau. Sounds a lot better. You just sort of see yourself strolling along a nice plateau in the western plains, on the western slope. But you know, it's just a broader peak, right? But they put it out several years. They put it at about 2030. Many in the peak oil crowd think that CIRA grossly underestimates the decline rate of existing productions, especially in the big field, that they're unrealistic about what that rate is, and that there's real-world evidence to suggest that they're mistaken about this. This is their recent report card. 2002, CIRA predicted that North American natural gas would increase by about 15% by 2010. Remains flat in North America. We're not really talking about natural gas here. I'm sorry to tell you that that's actually a bigger problem for North America in the short term than oil is. 2003 predicted price of oil would fall back to the 20s. Actually averaged $31. 2004 they guessed, oh yeah, probably 20s or 30s. You know, this year is probably going to fall back. Jumped to 65. You can see down here. They've been consistently overly optimistic, just like the EIA, just like most official agencies have been. One of the things to think about, most of the time we're not talking about reserves, right? Reserves is the size of the swimming pool. We don't really care about the size of the tank so much as we care about the size of the tap. But to the extent that we are talking about reserves, it's important to talk about this one point. Everybody reports reserve numbers from one source. It's a World Petroleum Survey that BP, British Petroleum, puts out every year that aggregates oil industry information, production, reserves, all kinds of stuff from across the industry, puts it out every year. Problem is, BP doesn't do any original research, and they will tell you that. They freely admit, don't rely on this. All we're doing is reporting what people tell us. It's basically a journalism exercise, which is a useful exercise as long as you understand what it is, that they're reporting the numbers that individual countries report to them. Now, something interesting happened with OPEC several years ago, and it was this incredible explosion in the size of their reserves. The numbers over here on the left are billions with a B, barrels of oil, reported by the various countries. You'll see all of these very dramatic jumps. And you say, wow, they must have had Peter and Bob running around there for them. They said, man, we need to find some more oil. Why don't you guys come over and find us some more oil? So, man, I mean, Saudi Arabia, that's that top number, jumped like, pretty much 100 billion barrels of oil in, a year. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, none of those relate to a discovery. What they do relate to is a change in the way that OPEC allocated production quotas. And after the Iranian Revolution and the big giant, the second oil crisis, OPEC decided that they would allocate production quotas based on your proved reserves. Lo and behold, people started finding all kinds of new reserves, but it wasn't new discoveries, right? They just came and they said, well, I mean, we've been conservative, we didn't want to brag or anything, but now that the production quota is tied to it, really, we've been looking at this a little harder, and we have an extra 100 billion barrels sitting in our pocket here that we didn't mention before. You can take that and make your own analysis as to how willing you are to believe that. The implication of it, I don't have that slide in here. These are the other 11 steps from the president's admission of our addiction. The implication of that slide before is roughly 330 billion barrels of oil. That's out of about 700 billion barrels of declared proved reserves for those countries. Just about half of the oil that they claim to have is questionable, I would say, at best. So now we get into the interesting debate. Are we going to have to walk here next month for the meeting, or do we have some time for this? I'm afraid I'm not going to give you an answer that's that definitive. What I am going to tell you that of the 65 countries that produce the most oil in the world, at least 54 have peaked, and they peaked in a way that it looks like they're unlikely to return. There are a few countries that's not clear for a while. Venezuela is a good example. Venezuela production peaked several years ago, but it's not clear whether that's going to be their ultimate peak or whether it's driven as much by underinvestment as anything else. On the other hand, people say that about Mexico, but that looks much less likely because so much of their production comes from a single field. That field is crashing in a way that is typical of production curves on the big fields in other parts of the world that have been managed in a similar fashion. And so the idea that they will be able to replace the third greatest oil field in the entire world anytime quickly is a difficult prediction to stand behind. 3, at least, or possibly all 4 of those fields we talked about at the beginning that produce over 1 million barrels of our oil a day, at least 3 of them have peaked, have been acknowledged to have peaked. Bergen, the Kuwaitis admitted a couple of years ago that Bergen peaked. As I said, Mexico has had to admit that Cantarell has peaked. It's creating a crisis day by day in Mexico. Also, the giant field in China is acknowledged to have peaked. The only question is Ghawar, the granddaddy field of them all. The Saudis insist that that has not peaked yet. Saudi production has been falling. It's a question, though. It could be that they're withholding production on purpose, but we don't have the data to analyze that. All we know is the production from the country has been falling. This is despite our price signal. This is despite the fact that the price signal is in fact working, and we're getting lots of big projects that are in development and are starting to come online. But it is important to recognize that the geological debate is interesting and it's important, but it's certainly not definitive. There are lots of other reasons there are lots of other things that affect oil production. I mentioned underinvestment as a possible factor in Venezuela. Certainly there's the picture in the front is from the first Gulf War. There's no doubt Iraq would be producing more oil if they were in peacetime. They certainly have more production capacity there. But wars and before the wars, Saddam Hussein's management of that industry kept them from producing at the rates that they could. Weather, Hurricane Katrina, things like that. There's lots of things that go into this. But the important thing to think about in this industry, and the thing that's hard to conceptualize if you're not part of it every day, is the immense sophistication of these big projects. Right? Remember the first slide about the distribution of fields. A small field that produces 20,000 barrels a day is a great field for Forest Oil Corporation. It does not really matter to global production rates. The big fields matter. And those projects are incredibly sophisticated. They're incredibly difficult. They need to be done by people who are in great demand in the industry. The industry has one of the oldest demographic profiles of any major industry in the world. I'm considered a young guy in the oil business. And so there's all these other things that go into it. But if you fall behind the curve, we've never had a time in the history of oil production that we haven't had significant additional barrels of capacity just sitting idle, just ready to be tapped if demand called on it. We have never, ever, for whatever reason, geological or geopolitical, other than the manufactured crises in the 70s, which were very short periods of time, never been in that position. And once you get behind that curve, it's really hard to catch back up. So I showed this slide when I gave the talk at the Evergreen High School And thank goodness these guys were in the picture. They would have had no idea what this cartoon was. But you all might recognize several of these folks, and you may recognize the message that you've heard administration after administration talking about how we're going to end our foreign oil dependence. The only way we're going to end our foreign oil dependence is by ending our oil dependence. So let's look at what people focus on when they talk about where the peak might happen. These are production curves set against the oil price. The blue line's the oil price. The other two are two reporting agencies for the production curve. It doesn't really matter so much where those curves sit numbers-wise as the shape of them, right? They've flattened for several years over a period of time that's had essentially unprecedented, nearly unprecedented rise in prices. That's an important fact. Again, the price rise, the economists say, but you just need the price signal, right? More money will invent more oil for you. If you have enough oil and you show up at the gas station, it will magically appear for you. Okay. What this shows us is the big projects around the world that have been developed over the last several years. It's a little bit confusing graph because each color is an earlier year, what they were predicting was going to come online. But what that means is that as it came to those years, it became much more accurate. Is all that it was really important about it. But so what this tells us is that the price signal's working. We're getting incredible additions in our production capacity. 2003, when the price rise had just started to run up, we got about an extra million, a little bit over 1 million barrels a day of added production. 2004, that was almost double that, over 2 million. 2005, oh, sorry, no you didn't. 2004, they thought they were going to do that, right? And then when the day actually came, it was actually about half. So we're at a little over 1 million of added production again. 2005, again, we were overly optimistic of what we thought was going to be new. But nevertheless, we had a big addition. Right? At the end of the day, we got about 2.5 million barrels a day of added production. 2006, right? Over 3 million barrels a day of added production. These are cumulative, right? So you got 1 plus 1, 2, add another 2.5, about 4.5, add another 3, about 7.5. 2007, this is pretty much accurate, 4.5. What is that like? 12 now? 12 million barrels a day? Well, wait a minute. This is the lawyer. The lawyer's gotten us into trouble. We've added 12 million barrels a day of incremental production in the last several years. So I've clearly screwed up here because I just told you the production is flat. How can that be? Always something that you need to consider when a lawyer's talking to you. I could be lying, but I'm not smart enough to make up graphs like this. I couldn't lie like that. We're getting new production. Excellent. Existing production must be down. This is the decline rate of our baseline production. Baseline production meaning before those graphs I just showed you, we had X number of barrels a day of production. So before we added that new stuff, what was the rate that existing production was starting to fall off? What's unfortunate about the graph is that it's accelerating. The first year, the baseline production was actually still growing, about 2%. 2005, it had become about flat. And again, remember, the baseline is changing each year, right? Because in 2005, that addition from 2004 is now part of the baseline. So it's not that you're ignoring this new oil, but that baseline production is still falling. And about midway through 2007, it had gotten to the point where it was about 4.5% a year. That's in line, actually, with ExxonMobil's public statements about what they think the global decline rate is of existing production. ExxonMobil is in that range. They're not crazy, right? They recognize that there will be a peak and there will be a peak someday. They're much closer to the Sierra end of that prediction spectrum, though. They think probably about 2030. But their prediction of the existing decline rate is about 4.5%. This is what that means. The green line here is the demand growth line, looking out into the future. This is about 2.5%, I think, if I remember this slide correctly, about 2.5% rate of increase in demand globally. That's a little bit higher than historically average, but it's a little bit lower than recent years' average. And that's because the immense increases in demand from China, from India, from Russia, from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, Brazil. So that's a pretty good guess if you had to guess into the future what the demand would be like. The red line is the supply, ignoring any predictions of new production, right? I'm not predicting that right now. I'm telling you, based on that decline rate, the production that we have today, that's what that curve is going to start looking like. And what you get is a big crocodile mouth. And what the blue line is showing how big that crocodile mouth is year to year. And again, this is, right? So this year, we got to make up, I think that works out to about 4 million barrels a day. Next year, it's more like 9. 9 million barrels a day is what Saudi Arabia produces every day. 2010, we're very close to 20 million barrels a day in added production we need. Now, there are big projects in the pipeline that look optimistically, but realistically, could produce an additional 15 to 20 million barrels a day of added production. That's the good news, right? But personally, I'd like more than 2 or 3 years of good news. And after that pipeline of big projects, it becomes increasingly difficult to convince yourself that these sort of numbers are realistic. So this is showing the peak graph for the United States. Again, the peak was about 70. 8K, that's Alaska. That's what happened when Prudhoe Bay came on. One of the best fields in the entire history of the oil business. Didn't quite bring us back to the peak. And we managed that very aggressively, so that when the peak did come at Prudhoe, it came hard and it fell hard. DW, that's deep water. That's the amazing technology that the oil and gas industry has developed to be able to find and develop oil in incredible places. You guys might have heard about the Jack discovery, that for a while everyone said, hey, quit listening to Langhus and the peak oil stuff, because Chevron just discovered the Jack field in the Gulf of Mexico. 15 billion barrels of oil found there with one well. It's a structure that spans about 250 square kilometers under the deepwater Gulf of Mexico. But nevertheless, Bloomberg thought that they could decipher from that 15 billion barrels of oil. We'll set that prediction aside. But what was amazing about that well was the technology that Chevron brought to bear on that project. It was amazing. It's drilled in about 6,000 or 9,000 feet of water. I always forget. A lot of water. Over a mile of water. And then close to 30,000 feet below the sea surface. The pressures that exist at that level are certainly incomprehensible for a lawyer, but it's incredible. The engineering that they were able to bring to bear on that project is truly stupendous. And these are the sort of things, right? If someone talks to you about, don't listen to Langhus about the peak oil. There's lots of oil out there. All we need to do is go find it. Well, guess what? Those people are looking for it. And they wouldn't be drilling a $200 million well 150 miles off of the coast of Louisiana in a place that's beset by Category 5 hurricanes every couple of years if there was something easier to find. They're smarter than that. This is sort of a metaphor for our government. You look at the picture here and you think, gosh, guys, there's something better you could be doing with your time. Another concept I want to cover is the idea of the net exports crisis. For you and me, not quite as much as me because I work for an oil company, but for you, you don't care as much about what the global production rate is. What you care a lot about is what is the number of barrels produced in the world that's available to be exported, preferably to you or to us. Production could grow forever, but if the pool available for export shrinks as it is now and continues to shrink, you will take very little comfort from the fact that the world is producing more oil. In the United States, we ceased being an exporter of oil either right before or right after the end of World War II. It wasn't until 1970 that we reached the peak rate of production. But by that point, we'd been an importer of oil for 30-some years, 20-some years. So, our production, right, everyone remembers our production is relatively flat since about 2005. Exports are falling. The reason for that is that the biggest demand growth, other than China and India, is coming in the biggest producers, biggest exporters. Norway even, although they're a very developed country, their demand growth is higher than OECD average. Russia's demand growth is nearly double digit. China and India's growth is double digit. Saudi Arabia, their demand growth is right around double digit. Iran, Venezuela, all of these countries that pump a lot of those barrels that are available for export currently are using more and more of their own oil every day. So, what does all this mean for us? It's important for me to get across when I do these talks. I don't come here, as surprising as it may be, to depress people or to scare people. I think that there are things that are well within our ability that can address this issue. But there's not really many issues that I think are more important for us to think about. And it's an issue that I think is close enough to hand that if we don't start thinking seriously about it, then we will miss the boat. And there will be consequences for not having thought about it. Robert Hirsch works for a big giant engineering firm, SAIC. He was contracted to do a report for the Department of Energy. It's called Peaking of World Oil Production, Impacts, Mitigation, and Risk Management. Published it in late 2005. He didn't make a big deal about predicting when it might happen. What he did say was that if you want it to be a smooth transition, you better start working on it 20 years before the peak hits. If you want to avoid significant economic, social, and political costs, you better start working on it hard before 10 years in front of the peak. So you saw the graph of the treadmill. You know what we have to do if we want that peak to be at least 10 years away. You can make your own guess about how likely that is. And from that, you can decide how seriously you and we need to take this. It's an election year. I certainly find it important every time I talk to a candidate, whether they're running for fire protection district, or whether they're running for Congress, or if Hillary stops by for a cup of coffee, I'll ask her. But these are questions that we should put to these folks who want to lead us. because there's not too much that's more important that they're going to have to be thinking about, in my view. But there are, again, it's hard because we've gotten so used to it, right? There's no one in this room, there's no one that any of us are related to, really, that can conceive of a time that we could not rely on ever-increasing quantities of almost always cheaper energy, right? That is our life, right? And it goes through every single thing that we do. It goes to where we live, right? Someone I read talked about how we're a nation that lives in $500,000 houses that we drive 50 mile commutes to and from in $50,000 SUVs, right? That's not a country that exists without cheap oil. That's not a paradigm that exists. We're a country that a couple of years ago, you could get 10 kiwi fruits for $1. Kiwi fruits are from New Zealand. 10 kiwi fruits for $1. And there are a lot of very important things that we rely on to put on trains, to put on trucks, certainly our jobs, the clothes that we wear. Agriculture, there are about 7 calories of fossil fuels that go into every calorie of corn. There are about 14 calories of fossil fuel energy that go into every calorie of beef that we eat in America. We eat oil and gas in this country. Not just this country, but we eat a lot more of it than most people. Public health. You ever think about if you're not in the healthcare industry, you go to the doctor, they got the plastic gloves, they do some plastic things with the, they take your blood, stuff like that. All this stuff gets thrown away because it's a biohazard, right? Last thing you want to know is that, oh yeah, no, I promise, I washed it real good after I took that other guy's blood. Yeah, trust me. I ran it through the dishwasher a couple of times. Right? They throw it away because it's more of a risk to keep it around and try to reuse it than to just charge you insurance and make new ones. That plastic all comes from oil. National security, right? For some reason, the politically correct position in the United States is that it's considered crude, excuse the pun, to suggest that the war in Iraq had something to do with oil. I'm not saying that that's the only reason, but I know it's the reason that we don't go into a lot of other places, right? If Saddam was living in, I don't know, Sudan, probably wouldn't be there. The fact that they have the second largest oil reserves in the world, I think, is probably got something to do with it. One of the things that I've started talking about in the election season with Mexico, and I've mentioned a few times now the crash of their giant Candarell field. Immigration has become an incredibly big focus in electoral politics in our country. Certainly, there are a lot of problems with how we've handled immigration before, and I don't want to get into a controversial discussion of those particularities. I think there's broad consensus, though, that there are problems that exist with the system. I think what there's also broad consistent support for is the idea that what fundamentally drives immigration, especially immigration from Mexico to the United States, is the fact that we have in many ways a country that people want to live in more than they want to live in their own country, whether that be for political freedom, whether that be for economic freedom and economic opportunity. The Mexican federal government gets 70% of its revenues from the export of oil. The current rate of decline for the Candarell field projects that without significant additions in Mexican production capacity, they will cease to export oil in about 10 years. That's important for us because they're our third largest exporter. They're behind Canada and Saudi Arabia only as our biggest source of foreign oil. But what do you think those people are going to do when that 70% of their government revenue is no longer there? We've got 1 million people from Mexico who want to come here every single year now. So if you want to give people who are running for office something to think about and something to talk about when they think that they've got some simple solution to all of our immigration problems that won't hurt at all and will make us all feel better, ask them that question. Ask them how they plan to deal with that one. This is my slide that shows how several of the issues that people talk sort of the most about right now, I think, as the big issues that we face, how these interact. We talked about agriculture and how much natural gas, especially, but also oil, it's reliant on. Obviously, it's also reliant upon produced water that seems to be running short in increasing numbers of places. Both of those things feed together to reduce agricultural productivity. If you reduce agricultural productivity, there are fairly predictable consequences of that. But certainly one of the consequences is it's going to shrink the economic growth of the whole enterprise, right? Oil and gas depletion feeds into the same problem. If we're not producing oil as much, we're definitely going to shrink our economy. The oil that we produce, in terms of the man hours that provides us, is the equivalent of having 22 billion slaves in the United States. That's how much work we get out of oil. It's an amazing substance. Oil at $10 a gallon, or gasoline at $10 a gallon, costs about 20 cents a cup. For a cup of gasoline, you can take you and 6 friends, hop in a cab, and go about 2 miles down the road. 20 cents. Now, you go up to a guy on the street with a cart and a donkey. You say, hey, I noticed you got a cart and a donkey here. Me and my 6 friends want to go to the club down the street. It's only about 2 miles down the road, but we got 20 cents for you. They going to take you up on that deal? Probably not. Oil is a hell of a deal. It is amazing. And, in a few years, we're going to be talking to our grandkids about oil. And they're going to say, man, you make plastics out of this stuff, you fertilize, you do all this stuff. But another thing that they advocate we focus on is efficiency. There are incredible gains to be made in more efficient housing, obviously more efficient transportation, things like that we need to focus on in order to make this transition smoothly that I think is coming. Electrification of transportation. The biggest problem with peak oil is it's not an energy problem as much as it's a liquid fuels problem, right? 95% of our oil goes to transportation. And so, I did this talk at the high school in Evergreen, did 3 different science classes. At the end of each class, I said, so what do we need to do to address this problem? And in each class, there was at least one kid who said, duh, we've got to, start building windmills and geothermal and solar, and we got to do plug-in hybrids. To which I would say, okay, you're done here. Go get your GED and run for Congress, because you're better off than most of the folks that are trying to run the country. We have a lot of inefficient price signals. Certainly, the worst are the subsidies. Biofuels, I think we can talk about that in the question and answer period, but biofuels, I think, are an incredible waste of our limited resources. They're a wrong path, and we're going to regret having gone down that path sooner rather than later. Renewables, obviously that's part of the thing. And whether that be wave energy and very exotic things like that, or the more traditional ones of wind and solar. Geothermal is a huge resource that's largely untapped. Enhanced oil recovery. is another thing that we really need to build in some incentives for. It's hard to get up here with a straight face and advocate for incentives for the oil industry. The price signal is a pretty strong one. But enhanced oil recovery, all that basically means is right, when we talked about the swimming pool, it ain't really a swimming pool. Well, one of the problems with it not being a swimming pool is you tend to produce, if you're lucky, half of the oil that's in place you end up producing from an oil field. So enhanced oil recovery are these various, increasing their varied range of sophistication of the technology, but they're different ways in getting more of that oil out, and they're worth doing. Cellulosic ethanol to replace the disaster that is corn-based ethanol. That's something that we should really be, and I think more broadly, we should be encouraging the government to fund fundamental research, basic research. Don't pick a horse and say, we think this is the horse. Fund scientists who are doing basic research and let large groups of people, the marketplace or individual localities that are experimenting in different ways, let them pick the horses to back. But the feds, just fund the scientists for now. And we have to talk about population growth. None of this is a problem except that there's 6.5 billion people in the world, and there are more and more every day. That's a problem that goes to climate change, it goes to agricultural crises, it goes to water crises, and it certainly goes to the fuel depletion issues. We need more mass transit, whether it's this or trains or something else. So that's basically it. These are a few resources I recommend to you, a few books here. Ken DeFaze is a Princeton geologist who is a son of one of the very earliest petroleum engineers in Oklahoma. He's an Okie like I am. He's an incredibly bright guy who worked for Hubbert at the Shell Lab in Houston for several years before he became a professor. Matt Simmons, Twilight in the Desert, that's an analysis of the Saudi oil industry and why he thinks that they might be at or near their peak. And a few websites here. Anyone who's interested in getting the PowerPoint, I'm happy to share it with anybody who wants it. You can put down my email address or my phone number. In case you can't read the email address, it's jlanghus@yahoo.com. I really appreciate you all having me here. Thanks very much. I'm sure I went over the allotted time.
The Bakken oil field in North Dakota and 300 billion barrels.
300 billion, wow. That's 2 zeros more than in recent days especially, there's been a lot of talk about the Bakken formation. The Bakken is an immense oil formation. It was originally thought to pretty much be limited to Montana. A place called the Williston Basin primarily, if memory serves. And there are a few producers that had successfully produced oil there. The problem is, right, if you remember back to our geology slide, the source rock is a little problematic. Certainly at $20 a barrel oil, the Bakken formation did not make much sense. It's a very difficult shale oil. You need to basically do horizontal wells with very sophisticated fracking, which basically means that you hydraulically pump liquid into the formation underground, and you do it with enough pressure that it actually fractures the rock, and you get more of the oil out as a result. It's a technology that the industry has developed quite a bit over the last decade, mostly in gas production actually. The Barnett Shale that you may have heard of is certainly the best success story for the North American gas industry in the last decade. That's sort of south of Fort Worth in Texas, central Texas. And so they've gone a long way in improving their ability to do horizontal drilling and especially these very sophisticated frac jobs. So that makes the Bakken worth thinking about. The other thing that makes the Bakken worth thinking about is that it's not just Montana, apparently. some smart guys like Peter went out and looked at it, and they said, you know, we're pretty sure that this goes down, you know, at least a little sliver of it into North Dakota. Well, Marathon Oil didn't get the memo, so they drilled in a totally different part of North Dakota, and they've made some very good wells there. So people are starting to think in very big terms about how big this formation is. But the number that I heard is about 5 billion barrels. 5 billion barrels, to put it in perspective, is about 2/3 of a year of U.S. oil consumption. Once again, I'd love it if Forest Oil had 4 billion barrels of oil, but it ain't going to move that peak date. It's just not big enough to move that date, really. Yes?
Can you please talk to us about natural gas?
Sure. Natural gas, it's hard, especially in a lecture of this length, to cover both oil and natural gas, but I did allude to that and say that I think that that's our bigger problem. Natural gas production in America, in the United States, peaked in 1973, actually very soon after oil, which was additionally interesting because we tended to not use much of it for a long time. We flared it a lot of times, just burn it up without using it for anything. But when the oil crisis came, people said, geez, we got a ton of gas. We need to start doing, you know, everyone's home needs to be heated with gas, and we need to build gas-fired electric plants. Not only does that make sense because it burns cleaner, but with a gas-fired power plant, you can switch it on and off pretty easily. So it's great for peak demand. Coal-fired power plants, it's very difficult to turn them off and on again. So we use those for base load capacity, let them run sort of all day long, 24 hours a day. And then we use the gas ones to flip on and off when we need extra power. So we started using a ton of gas. And we've been declining since about 1973. We actually export gas to Mexico, because Mexico hadn't any help there. So Canada is essentially making up the difference. What Canada isn't making up, we do in what's called liquefied natural gas. This is, again, one of the more sophisticated ends of the industry. What they do is they take gas in some other part of the world and they supercool it so that it condenses. They put it on these very expensive ships, and they bring it over across the ocean, and they plug it into a regasification plant, and then they turn it back into gas again and float into the pipelines. It's very expensive to do. It's very labor-intensive, capital-intensive, and there are consistent worries. This really seriously is an area where I don't feel real comfortable talking about as a lawyer because I'm not sure how realistic the fears are. But there are a lot of fears about those ships. And what might happen if a September 11th type thing happened and someone purposefully crashed a plane into one of those. Every time an LNG ship goes into Boston, they shut down Logan Airport. They mainly shut down the harbor. It's an incredible disruption to the entire city for these sort of fears. Like I said, I'm not qualified to evaluate whether those are realistic fears, but they certainly are there. So Canada peaked in their gas production a couple of years ago. And that was after a staggering increase in drilling activity. They went in '96 from drilling about 4,000 gas wells a day to drilling now over 20,000 gas wells a day. What that tells you about is the decline rate of natural gas fields right now, and they are steep. Some places they're 30% a year for gas wells. So the problem is that the treadmill we're on in natural gas is very rigorous. And in the last year in Canada, the gas price collapsed, certainly relative to oil. And so people didn't want to drill for gas, they wanted to drill for oil. So once again, without even getting into the geology, we've put ourselves in a position where we're behind the curve now. So we went into this winter with the highest gas storage levels in North America ever. About 3.5 trillion cubic feet of gas in storage. And that was because we had no hurricanes for 2 years in a row in the Gulf of Mexico. And we had 2 mild winters in a row. We've had a more severe winter this year. So even though we started at this highest level of natural gas storage ever, probably on Thursday when they release the natural gas storage report, we will have now fallen below the 5-year average for gas and storage for this time of year. So we burned through all that extra gas. And so we're now at an uncomfortable position where it's hot enough now in the south where people are starting to turn on their air conditioners, but it's still cold enough in the northeast where people are still using heat there. Keep an eye on your natural gas price.
You alluded briefly to Colorado oil shale. Could you
Yes.
expand on that a little?
Oil shale, like the tar sands in Alberta, is oil that really isn't quite done yet. So what you need to do is finish getting it done. The problem that these two places raise is one that we call energy return on energy invested. Right? You want to know how much more energy you get out of a process than you put in. Because if that ain't a positive number, you're wasting your time. Right? That's historically been the problem with the oil shale. And people have said for over 30 years, it was like, mid-70s that Exxon built the giant town and parachute out by Rifle, where they were going to do the oil shale out there during the first energy crisis. And they've always been saying, man, if the oil price was just $10 higher, we could make oil shale economic. But you can't, because you're feeding energy into that process. And so, yeah, you get a 10% higher return on what comes out, but you paid 10% more for what you put in. So no one has made that equation work yet. The other problem with the oil shale is it's incredibly energy intensive, and it's incredibly water intensive. It's on the western slope of Colorado. There's not a whole lot of extra water there that the Californians wouldn't like to see just keep going on by. The energy, Shell's proposal for doing their development there calls for a 2 megawatt nuke plant to get the energy. Nuke plants take a lot of water, amongst other things.
How about natural gas into hydrogen?
Well, the problem with hydrogen is that hydrogen isn't a fuel. It's an energy storage medium, right? And so it's the same problem: energy in, energy out. So the best idea for hydrogen, the benefit of hydrogen is it's a liquid fuel. So it has the benefit of oil that you can put it in a gas can, and as long as it's a pressurized gas can, you can carry it around with you. So the problem though is you need to get that hydrogen, right? So the typical way that people talk about it is probably electrolysis. So you take water, you fire up a nuke plant or a battery of windmills or a battery of solar arrays, and you zap them like we all did in 9th grade science class, and you separate out the hydrogen from the oxygen. Okay, that's great, so you get a liquid fuel. Well, you got a liquid fuel, so you got to have a liquid fuel distribution network too, right? You got to have gas stations that now are doing hydrogen. You got to have a pipeline network to get that hydrogen from place to place. You got to have special trucks that truck hydrogen all around. So even if it's energy positive, it's an incredible commitment in terms of infrastructure. You're talking about duplicating an infrastructure that we built up over 100 years. Doing that in time to fix, to get ahead of the peak problem.
My question was, how about the natural gas into hydrogen?
Larry, we've got 2 more questions ahead of you, please.
Same basic.
Back here's George.
Same basic problem. I mean, you still got to get that hydrogen network built, and it's still questionable that you're going to get more energy out than you put in.
What's the probability of finding abiotic oil?
Abiotic oil, that's the theory that we're still making oil, basically. I don't subscribe to it, but again, that's an area where I legitimately feel underqualified to discuss. And that's one where, unfortunately I go back to, well, my dad's a scientist and he thinks it's full of crap, so do I. But not only my dad, I mean, I know lots of smart guys who are scientists in the oil business, and we argue about a lot of this stuff. That's not one of the things we argue about, though.
What about nuclear? That's a good answer. Behind you.
What do you think about drilling in Anwar?
I'm an oil guy that doesn't think that we should be drilling in Anwar, and that's because I spent several vacations as a young man in Alaska. Look, it's added oil. I guess part of me would say, gosh, maybe we should save some of it. if no other reason, just maybe we should save some of it until maybe we're a little bit smarter and we think something good to do with it. But the other thing is that it's just not a quantity to justify the effort. You know, again, it's 6 or 10 billion barrels a year, and I recognize the danger in that logic, right? Right? People will come to you and they'll say, look, you know, 6 to 10 billion barrels here and there. Pretty soon you got a big pile of oil, and that would be useful, and that is absolutely true. But at the same time, it's, you know, we burn 30 billion barrels of oil a year in the world. The grand scheme of things, it's just not that much oil. It's in a special place, but more importantly, it's in a pretty damn far away place, right? It's not just a matter of going up there and saying, okay, you boys have at it, and 6 months later we're getting oil from Anwar. You know, you're talking at least 10 years between the day that all the approvals go into place and you get a drop of oil out of Anwar. That's what the people that I worked with in Alaska, who spent their whole careers in Alaska working for the big guys, BP, ARCO, things like that, no sooner than 10 years. Yes. Oh, sorry, you had a nuke question. Lots of the eco guys are into nukes now because of the global warming thing. I'm sort of on the fence with that. I certainly think that it's something that we should think about. Partially, I'm actually more drawn to it for the global warming argument than I am for the energy argument. Part of the problem is that our existing nuke stock is aging. So we need to build something like, I don't know, several hundred nuke plants over the next 20 years just to replace the aging ones. Right? So that's a lot of building of nuke plants. About half of the fuel that we have for nuke plants right now comes from the reprocessing of Russian nuclear weapons. Something that not very many people know about. But I mean, we know that we're doing that because that was one of the great stories that came out of the end of the Cold War was we convinced the Russians to give up most of their nukes and we convert that into feedstock for nuclear reactors. Unfortunately, we're about out of Russian nuclear weapons, except for the ones that Mr. Putin has decided he'd like to just hang on to if it's all right with us. So there's an incredible gap there in uranium production that we're going to have to address. Yes.
As someone who has worked in Alaska, I am always amazed at the misconceptions and inaccuracies around Anwar. So I would hope the audience and the country as a whole would understand the facts. My question is this whole issue of peak oil and the politics and how do we address the problem has been going on for a long time. Democrats, Republicans, and so forth. So I'm wondering, in your view, when do we reach that tipping point at which our leaders actually start doing something of a concrete nature and trying to fix the problem?
I think that's an easy question, actually. I think that our history bears it out. Our leaders typically act, at least in a critical mass, when it's enough of them acting together to do something, when a crisis hits. And that's actually been one of the interesting things about the last few years, is we've had a 10-time, the oil price has increased, well now 11.5 times, right, since what it was in the late 90s. But it's happened over almost a decade, right? It's the typical frog in the boiling water, right? You stick a frog in a pot of boiling water, it's going to get the hell out of there. But if you put a frog in a pot of cold water and you gradually turn up the temperature, it will sit in that pot and boil to death, right? So every day we go out and gas is a little bit more expensive and things like that, and we complain a little bit more about it. But the fact of the matter is that certainly of the people in this room, we can afford $3 gas. We can afford $5 gas. People in this room can probably afford $10 gas, right? But remember that graph, right? We got all that new production, and the production's flat. We got increasing demand here and in several other countries in the world, but production is flat. We're using more than we were using 4 years ago. Russia's using a lot more. Someone's using less. And it's about 2 billion people that are using less. And they're not using less, they're using nothing now. And they only started using it about 10 years ago. Right? 10 or 15 years ago when it got really cheap after the last oil crash. And they're probably not going to get to use it anymore. Right? And they don't use it for stuff like we use it for. I mean, some of what we use it for is what they use it for, but they use it for, water treatment plants. They use it for lighting one building in a village so that kids can do homework after the sun goes down. They do it to, fuel a generator at a hospital so that the very small supply of medicine that they have doesn't go bad because they don't have refrigeration. Right? That's what they don't have anymore. So until we get some sort of a crisis here, I'm afraid, our guys in the big chairs aren't going to do a whole lot about it.
A few years back, there was a discovery of large quantities of ice and methane complex under high pressure on the seafloor, and the extent of it was being discovered. What has happened to that? What is that information?
Those are called methane hydrates. What it basically is ice that's frozen around methane molecules. So the methane should be a gas, but this ice froze around it in such a way that it captured the methane. So yeah, people talk about that as an immense source of energy because it is probably many trillions of cubic feet of gas locked up in methane hydrates. The problem is no one's really figured out a way how to capture them. What we do know about it from the oil industry is that if you're drilling offshore and you're in a drill ship, and you get into one of these, you can sink a boat because you release all of a sudden this giant cloud of underwater gas, right? Underwater gas makes bubbles, right? Bubbles are full of air. Ships don't float on air nearly as well as they float on water, right? So I mean, what it really is a big worry for global warming, because if they melt, that's one theory of what happened in the Permian extinction, right? Biggest extinction that we've had in the history of the Earth. About 97% of the known species died off. One of the theories is that a comet hit somewhere and released this giant store of methane. Methane's like it's maybe 10 times as strong a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide, is that right? Many times stronger as a greenhouse gas, but it's short-lived, so we don't worry about it as much as we worry about carbon dioxide. But in something like that, some sort of cataclysmic release of that stuff, it becomes a huge climate change problem.
Last question.
Okay?
One thing we have an awful lot of is coal, and I believe in South Africa, Sasol has been manufacturing methanol for many years as a liquid fuel. What about coal? And of course, there's global warming issues.
Sure.
With that.
Sure. Setting those aside, though, I think that's one of the things some of the peak oil researchers have focused on recently, is looking at challenging that assumption that we all have about how much coal we really have. Most of the coal reserve data that we have is significantly lower quality data than our oil data. The United States has actually peaked on a BTU basis, British Thermal Unit, quantities of energy, in coal production already a few years ago. That's because we burned up all the good coal in the Appalachians and Illinois, Indiana, places like that. And now we're burning the lower quality, lower energy content coal. So we're producing more tons of coal every year, but we're actually getting less energy from it. But yeah, the South Africans, basically because of apartheid and the sanctions that went along with that, they took up the Fischer-Tropsch method of gasification of coal. they there's the gasification into like natural gas, methane. There's also the coal to liquids that they do. The Germans developed that in World War II when we cut them off from their oil fields and they needed something to put in their tanks and airplanes. It works. It's quite a bit worse carbon dioxide wise than the coal is by itself. It's a benefit because it's a liquid fuel. Again, there is benefit to having a liquid fuel. But I think there are several problems with deciding that coal is going to be the solution.